What's your name?
James.
Jesse James.
LeBron James.
I really like End of the World movies. And I don't care if it's zombies or aliens or natural disasters, just as long as it's apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic, I'm good. But the bad part is that most of them are just these lazy, low-budget garbage with a bunch of washed-up actors and PlayStation 2 quality CGI monsters. It's really hard to explain exactly what makes a good End of the World movie, because sometimes it's the characters that make it good, and other times it's the scenarios that cause the apocalypse. And it's really the same on the opposite side too, because sometimes a movie has the budget and the actors and even a plot that sounds good, but for some reason it still ends up being trash. The Vanishing on 7th Street is a movie that had so much potential to become a franchise, but the writer thought it would be better to just not develop the monster or try to explain anything and leave every detail ambiguous. So if I had to blame anything for its failure, it'd be the editing and the writing, because it had a solid cast, a decent budget, a really interesting concept, and it was directed by Brad Anderson.
Who?
He directed one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and he also directed a few other really good movies too. So I don't know what the hell he was thinking with this movie, because he obviously has the skills to crush a story like this.
I guess not.
The plot is simple. The shadows come alive, and anyone that's not near a light gets taken into the darkness. It's basically what Left Behind would be as a horror movie. Just remove the Jesus explanation and mix it with a little bit of Lights Out and The Darkest Hour. This is the perfect end of the world scenario for a horror movie, and it ends up being one of the biggest financial flops ever relative to its budget, because it only made $22,000 on a $10 million budget.
What the?
We start off in a movie theater, and right away we get a clever Easter egg because the movie titles are foreshadowing the plot. Even though these both would have been better titles for the movie because no one actually vanishes on 7th Street. The first survivor we meet is Paul, and he's the socially awkward exposition character that's only in the movie so he can explain everything to us later. You've seen this character archetype a million times before. Sometimes it's a crazy homeless guy or an old woman in an isolated house or even a college professor, but it's always the same thing. They're an expert in some obscure demon or an old mystery that no one else knows about, and they give us a creepy exposition dump right before the third act starts so we can learn the history and the weaknesses of the monster. And just so you know he's gonna have all the answers, we see him reading a book about unexplained mysteries.
Nerd!
He's reading a book about probably the worst unexplained mystery of all time, and the lights in the building suddenly go off. It doesn't take long for the backup generator to come on, and when it does, everyone's gone. So Paul walks around the mall trying to find any survivors, and oh shit, it's a black guy! He's probably gonna survive to the end, right?
No.
It's always a bad sign for a black character if he's not a well-known actor like Will Smith or Idris Elba, because if it's just some Randy like this, he's for sure gonna die first. He gets about 15 seconds of screen time before he remembers that he's a no-name black guy in a horror movie.
Excuse me, I gotta go do some black guy stuff. I really miss my nigga.
There's no way a mall security guard would be doing all this Scooby-Doo investigation shit. But Paul's even worse because even after he sees Randy disappear, he doesn't scream or run, and he just stands there like he's waiting for his turn to die. Then we get probably the most obvious and telegraphed jump scare in cinematic history.
What the fuck?
In a story where the shadows are alive, there's so many opportunities for good jump scares, but this is the only one in the movie, so I don't know why Anderson even decided to put it in.
Pause.
The next survivor we meet is Rosemary. She's a nurse running around an empty hospital, and this is where we first see that the shadows are actually alive. She finds a man in the middle of having open heart surgery, and nothing about this scene makes any sense.
Was at the hospital bed. Said, nigga, are you dead?
Why did the lights only come back on in this room? And if the lights went out, why did the doctors get taken away but not him? Oh, and for some reason the mall has emergency lights, but the hospital doesn't.
Well, that's just silly.
And now that I think about it, why did the security guard survive? The only reason certain people survive is because they were near some sort of light. And it makes sense why Paul had his headlight on, but why did the security guard have his flashlight on before the lights went out? The next survivor we meet is Luke. He wakes up next to some candles, and we're supposed to believe that these 3 tiny-ass candle flames were enough to save him. This happened with Rosemary too. She survived because she was smoking a cigarette, so if that's all the light it takes, there should be thousands of people that survived in the city. So anyway, he leaves to go to work and he walks through the lobby and he doesn't even notice all the clothes laying on the ground, even though he looks directly at the first pair of clothes that he walks by. But then he sees the security guard's entire outfit laid out like he's getting ready for the first day of school. Because it's not just his jacket, it's his pants, his shoes, his tie, everything. He goes outside and finally realizes that something's wrong.
Kobe!
Then we get a 72 hours later. And I'll talk about it in a minute, but Luke's story is where the movie should have started. Anyway, we cut to Luke running around a dark-ass alley searching cars for supplies. Then a homeless guy runs up out of nowhere begging for a flashlight.
Hey, open the door! Stupid, I'm not gonna let you get the chance.
Even though he should have just used his crack lighter to burn some shit in a trash can like movie bums always do.
Just enough for the city I'm living.
Then we see a little girl with a flashlight. At first I thought she was going to be part of the darkness, like she was either possessed or a hallucination to get people to follow her or give up their light, but she ends up being just a regular little kid. And somehow she survived alone for 3 days and she feels comfortable enough to be hanging out in a pitch black Detroit alley.
Fuck no!
Anyway, the bar is the only building with the lights on, so Luke goes inside for a drink because fuck it, why not, right?
Shit, they got Duce here. Fuck some of this Costume Ego shit though. On God.
He finds a generator in the basement that's been keeping the lights on, and this is where we meet James. Luke tries to make friends, but James ain't really fucking with him because he knows what happened last time this guy was alone with some kids.
Stupid, I'm not gonna let you get the chance.
After a Jedi mind trick, we learn that James is waiting for his mom to come back, and because Detroit is such a small city, Rosemary ends up at this bar hysterically looking for an infant baby that disappeared 3 days ago. And for the second time, someone tries to shoot Luke and misses. Kinda hard to shoot a Sith Lord, I guess.
Just like a woman.
And I know it could be purely coincidence, but Rosemary's baby? Seriously? Or naming his character Luke? For real? And oh, remember the guy that got jump scared to death in the mall? Well, somehow he's back from the dead and he's conveniently a few blocks away from this bar. Even though Luke locked the door on a homeless guy a few hours ago, he decides to risk his life to run down the street to save some guy that he can't even see. And because horror movies always have to have the black guy die first or a car that won't start, this one goes for the trifecta of movie cliches and has Luke twist his ankle. I think this is probably why the black character always has to die first, because I don't think it's possible for a black person to twist their ankle when they're running away from danger. So they make it back to the bar, and this is where we find out what happened to Paul.
And then someone came out of the dark and hit me. I was taken somewhere. And then my light came back on. And I was outside.
So the darkness punched him in the face, took him to the Shadow Realm for 3 days, and then decided to be a bro and drop him off at the bar?
Nigga, please.
The whole reason he came back is so he can try to explain the plot, because telling is a lot better than showing, I guess. And he couldn't even do that right, because he just starts saying a bunch of smart-sounding shit that doesn't really explain anything.
Flesh-eating bacterias, nanotech run amok, a particle collider accident, parallel universes, neutron bombs, gamma ray bursts, wormholes, black holes, but the thing is that the math doesn't add up.
41 monastically spaced grouting brushes were arranged to fade into the rotor slipstream a mixture of high S-value phenyl hydrobenzamine.
But the bigger question is, why isn't Paul naked right now?
Nigga,
When people disappear, we see piles of clothes and jewelry and phones and stuff, so why did the darkness let Paul keep his clothes on when it took him? And this begs an even bigger question too. What the hell is the darkness doing when it takes people? It's not killing them because Paul was just hanging out for 3 days, so what's the point of all of this? Does it just take everyone and let them starve to death in the darkness? This is a problem that so many writers have with horror stories. They have an interesting scenario or a concept, but they never develop the details. And this is what I was talking about with It Follows. The idea sounds great on the surface, but when you start asking questions, the idea falls apart because some ideas are only meant to be short stories. And I'm working on a longer video right now about why horror movies don't feel scary anymore, and I'm going to introduce a new concept called superficial horror that'll explain all of this. But this is when the poor editing choices really slow down the story. Because the shadows are never developed or explained, the only thing we get is each survivor telling us what they were doing when everyone disappeared. Even though we already saw what happened at the start of the movie. Luke's story should have been the only survivor backstory that we saw, and the first time we see Rosemary and Paul should have been at the bar. That way we'd be seeing their flashback stories for the first time and would also make us skeptical of each one. Something that adds tension to movies like this is not knowing who to trust. Nobody knows each other, so it would add another layer of mystery if we never got the Suicide Squad introductions and just waited for each survivor to tell their story when they got to the bar. That way, the audience wouldn't know if each story was real or if one of them was being used by the darkness to trick everyone else. The movie's almost over, and because we haven't had a death in a long time, everyone decides to split up so the shadows can give everyone a cinematic death scene. Rosemary runs back to the hospital to look for her baby. Paul goes into an underground tunnel looking for James. For a guy who spent 3 days in the darkness, he's not that concerned about being in a dimly lit underground tunnel. I mean, just look at this shit. Why would you ever go down here for any reason? Luke wants to use the generator to get one of the cars started because he thinks there's a safe place in Chicago. Him and James drive off and see the word Croatoan spray painted on a bridge. The Roanoke Island disappearance was one of the ideas from Paul's Unexplained Mysteries book, even though it really doesn't make any sense in this situation. Now, if you didn't know the story, English settlers were living on a small island off the coast of North Carolina, and some of the group sailed back to England. And when they came back 3 years later, the island was abandoned and the word Croatoan was carved into a tree. This story is always told like they said, hey, I'm just gonna run to the store real quick and I'll be back in 10 minutes, and when they came back, everyone was gone. They were gone for 3 years. Do you know how much shit could happen in 3 years? I don't know, I just never thought this story was that interesting or scary when you compare it to other unexplained mysteries. But the bigger question is, who spray painted this? The darkness? And who's supposed to see this on a random overpass in Detroit if everyone in the world is gone? Anyway, James thinks his mom is at church, so he runs inside and Luke becomes more powerful than we can possibly imagine. Oh, and remember the little girl from the beginning? Well, this is where she's been surviving because the power of Jesus, I guess. Everyone dies except the 2 little kids, and they ride off into the sunrise like a scene from the first episode of The Walking Dead. Because 2 kids living in Detroit definitely know how to ride a fucking horse. And where the hell are they going? I don't know if this movie's trying to say that everything's going back to normal or if this is supposed to leave room for a sequel, but just like everything else in this movie, it's really stupid. This movie is terrible. I like the evil shadows idea, but it wasn't developed enough to leave the ending ambiguous or open for a sequel. This movie didn't add anything to the original concept, and it cost way too much to make such a simple idea.